everyone. If you like the Fitness Daily, just know that it's brought to you by Zor Fitness. At Zor Fitness, we offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for athletes and coaches. You can find it all in one place, zorfitness.com. Welcome to the Fitness Daily podcast. We got Sean today. Thank you for joining us, Sean.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. This has been, I apologize for the inconsistencies and trying to set this podcast up, but with a lot of travel these past couple of weeks, it's just been a bit tough. But I'm very happy to be on here and happy to actually, we've had so many like discussions just briefly over the years. Very excited to actually talk training for once.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. So I'll give you some time to give you an introduction because I think you have a really interesting background. But for those who don't know, Sean is a powerlifting coach. He's very well known in the space, and he's one of those people that, when he posts things, it's like there's this automatic credibility to him. Like he speaks very well, and you could tell he knows a lot about the sport and the art of powerlifting. And with a sport like powerlifting and bodybuilding and a lot of strength sports, it's very saturated with coaches. So sometimes it's hard to find good coaches, and I think Sean is one of the best ones that is out there. So yeah, Sean, if you want to give a little introduction about yourself, and we'll dive deep a little bit more.
Yeah, I appreciate your introduction. Very, very kind words. I appreciate that. Yeah, so my name's Sean Noriega. As you guys have heard, I'm a powerlifting coach and a powerlifting competitor. I've been in the sport of powerlifting for 11 years now. And I started taking powerlifting more seriously actually when I was in undergrad at MIT. And I never pictured that this would be my full-time career. I remember having conversations with some coaches at the time that I enjoyed coaching part-time, and this was just going to be something I did as a passion project. And some of them had the wisdom and foresight to say, no, this is what you're going to do full-time. And they were right. So yeah, I've been coaching powerlifting as a career, either part-time or full-time, since 2014. And it was a career that was definitely catapulted at a very fortunate time. Right around the time powerlifting really started to blow up, powerlifting coaching really started to blow up. I made some really good connections, really good client base was built up at a fortunate time, and I've been able to coach a lot of lifters nationally, internationally. I've had a couple national and world champions on my roster, and then now have a team of 5 coaches in total that work under Nori Powerlifting.
Yeah, and I know I've like heard and found out about you through MIT. Because two ways. One was I was part of ROTC, Air Force ROTC, and a lot of the guys in my class like to lift. And I remember your name being brought up, and they're like, "Oh yeah, have you seen like that guy Sean lift and all that?" And then I remember seeing you sometimes in the rec center lifting, and I'm just like, this dude's putting like, there's no way he's a recreational lifter. Like he's just in here, just like lifting all this weight. There has to be like a background to this. So that's how I kind of found out about you. And then obviously through Instagram and all that. So with that, I know did you start powerlifting when you were at MIT? Did you start beforehand? Did you have another athletic background before powerlifting?
So I played baseball for 14 years, and I dabbled in powerlifting as a high school student, but I wouldn't say that I took it seriously until I got to college. Baseball was my passion. It was my life, honestly. Like I always saw a downtick in GPA when I was in middle school and high school whenever baseball season came around because I just didn't want to do anything else. And around high school year with like high school years with every sport, there becomes an emphasis on weight training, and I think naturally I was just good at it. And it was something that was very quantitative and effort driven, where you put in X and you get out Y. It's very, your results are very correlated to effort, which I really like because, the unfortunate thing with something like baseball is, you can put in all the effort you want, but, you could start a season and go 0 for 20, and it can be very unpredictable. So I gravitated very naturally toward lifting. And I had done a meet my senior year of high school, but I wouldn't say that I was a power lifter then. I was just lifting for baseball, naturally gravitated toward the big three lifts, and just decided to throw my hat in the ring because there was a meet kind of near where I lived, and one of my friends had encouraged me to do it. But it wasn't until I found, my first coach when I was in college, got more enveloped in the like powerlifting sphere of social media. And then finally in the springtime of 2015 was like, yeah, I'm not going to play baseball. I'm just going to commit to powerlifting. That was when it really kind of took off for me, as an athlete.
Yeah. And so when you started, was it something that you were like, yeah, I'm just going to compete a few times, or did you already see like envision like, hey, I want to get here in this sport?
So I definitely did not envision being where I'm at. Definitely not as a coach, that's for sure. When I started, because I actually had reached out to my first powerlifting coach in 2014 with sort of a preamble to my inquiry of like, hey, I'm going to be playing college baseball in the spring. Like, I just want to do a meet before the season starts. Which now looking back as an established coach, like if someone sent me an inquiry saying they just wanted me to coach them for a meet, I would toss that inquiry out immediately. But I was lucky enough for him to take me on. And then after I had done that meet, the world of powerlifting kind of along the same timeline was opened up to me where it was like, hey, there's this national event, there's IPF Worlds, and after doing that first USAPL meet, I was like, well, it's set, right? I'm going to keep going with this. And I remember being a freshman in college, thinking to myself, like, okay, where is the current standard of the 83 kilo class at? And I was like, well, a lifetime goal, I would love to total 1,600 pounds. And like now it's, in order to win the 83 kilo class, like the group of us will probably have to be pushing, you know, toward that 1950 to even 2,000 pound total over the next couple of years. It's like the sport as a whole is far beyond what I even anticipated, much less where I'd be at. So
Yeah. I think it's the same thing with CrossFit. It's like you join and the let like depending on what year you joined, the standard was here. And like as years go on, that standard just keeps getting higher and higher. Um,
it's,
and it's just like you just got to keep getting better and better, like to keep up. So like people who have been really competitive back then, it's kind of like you just have to keep riding it and just keep going because like people are coming in and like this bar keeps getting set higher and higher. And I feel like it's the same thing with powerlifting too. Like those numbers are getting pretty ridiculous.
yeah, no, it's insane. Are there certain events in CrossFit that you're seeing? Like, is there just like an across the board improvement? Because I can't imagine like running times are improving that much. Like, where is like the biggest, I guess, area of improvement that CrossFit has seen? Is it on the lifting side or is it other events as well?
Yeah, I would say it's the lifting side, like because most of the time people always have like a really good engine, and you'll see them, being able to complete these workouts like at insane times. And now it's like, so what they were lacking was strength. So you would see like, especially like in Olympic lifting and all that, the snatch and the clean and jerk, and then squat, bench, and deadlift weren't as great. It
Yeah.
was above average, but like nowhere competitive to a power lifter or an Olympic weightlifter, depending on what lift you're talking about. Now
Mm.
it's like high level CrossFit athletes, their like strength numbers, like Olympic lifting or powerlifting, are pretty like competitive now. So you'll see
Mm.
some people who are like up there, and it's just like wild, like to see.
Yeah.
There's one girl who's an anomaly, but I'm sure you've heard of her name, Tia Claire Toomey. She's like
Mm.
the CrossFit champ. I mean, she was also an Olympian for Olympic lifting, you
Oh,
know?
really?
And
Yeah.
yeah, and that was like she started CrossFit, I think it was, and then went Olympic lifting. Like,
Hmm.
and like just decided to take this venture on and then went back to CrossFit just because she could.
Yeah.
It's like wild to like think about, but yeah. So those numbers are constantly being pushed. So there's a lot of factors involved, like performance enhancing drugs and all that stuff. But
Fair enough.
some natural people, I think, are really bringing those standards up as well.
Yeah. No, I mean that doesn't surprise me. I mean, the strength world is has not yet reached a carrier capacity at all. And I think it really is just of what we've learned more about programming for strength compared to previous decades. And like on the powerlifting side, right, what was capable, what was possible, 10, 15 years ago at the peak, probably a lot of people would have assumed, you had to be on some sort of drugs to get there. And I mean, now those same standards, people wouldn't even bat an eye if you were that strong now. And I think it really it's come down to programming. Obviously there are some genetic anomalies that enter the sport maybe at a greater frequency than they previously did, but I don't think that it's enough to account for the uptick, right? Because we're not just seeing more people hit the same total; we're seeing just completely uncharted territory, across all weight classes.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the programming side of things, how do you usually like, that's a very vague general question. So what changes have you made like from when you started to now? Like, did you just start, let's say when you started powerlifting, did you start training people like X amount of years after? And from when you started coaching, how has that changed to now?
Yeah, I mean, so there's so much that has changed on the programming side of things from when I started. Like, I'm sure if I were to go back and look at some of the programs I wrote, if not most of the programs I wrote when I first started, I would probably cringe at what was put on the page. But I think if I had to summarize what powerlifting training kind of looks like across the board for all high level coaches, and obviously people have their own different biases when it comes to, you know, certain exercise selection or certain accessories or styles of, just like there's little details that may be different from coach to coach, or maybe, if you run into a wall progress wise, maybe one coach is more likely to take one route before another coach. You might have three options of what you could do, and somebody takes option one more often, somebody takes option two. But I think fundamentally how I would describe what we do is, in order to get any of the big three lifts to progress, there are a few key variables that you have to optimize. The first one being like how frequently you need to perform the lift in order for like skill acquisition to take place, and in order to like divvy up the training stress appropriately. Second to that would probably be, like how much total workload do you need to perform in order to progress. Um, and then beyond that, there are going to be sensitivities to like intensity within a session, certain rep ranges, and then like the pace of progression. So if I had to describe in very general terms what a training week looks like for any of the given lifts, it would be a frequency that is required. So like in terms of minimum frequency, we need a minimum amount of exposures to a lift that is going to have us feeling trained or primed to perform that lift. And then within that, we need to optimize how much total workload is being done so that we are performing optimally, right? So it's like enough workload so that performance can be peaked or primed for the main session of emphasis for that lift within a week, but obviously not so much that performance takes a considerable hit because of fatigue, or that it generates enough fatigue to make performance unpredictable. So we want predictability of performance, and we also want some kind of proxy to determine if what we're doing is working. And usually what that is there's always some sort of like indicator set, so to speak, on any of the three lifts within the week. And that's in powerlifting what people would probably coin or term as like a primary day, right? You have a day of emphasis where there is a top set being done that is fairly accurate at estimating what your one rep max is. And the goal of that day is not, at least for most of your training, is not to take a one rep max. You might not even have a single as your top set, but it's a measurement of whether or not what we're doing is actually moving the needle forward, right? Are we actually progressing? And then what fills in the gaps after that are, how much volume do we need to do in order to get this lift to progress? And what does that volume need to be comprised of? Right. So it's not just, and this is kind of an antiquated way of doing things, is It's not just that we do like a volume block for this portion of the year, and then we do like a quote unquote strength block where we're undulating drastically between rep ranges and as a result, different training qualities. What we've kind of learned is that you can train different training qualities concurrently, meaning that you can work in higher intensity ranges and lower intensity ranges simultaneously. But that also people have different sensitivities to what actually they respond well to. So, like the textbook sort of definitions of periodization would imply that, oh, if I'm doing low rep stuff, that's going to make me stronger and prime me for strength because I'm being exposed to that. But we know very well that there are tons of lifters where if like some of the strongest lifters on earth, if you were to program them high intensity work all the time, like they might get injured, they might just maladapt where like they're just getting weaker. And sometimes what you see is that there are lifters whose one rep maxes get better from training high rep, or there are lifters whose one rep maxes get better from training very submaximally. So there's kind of a different, there are sets of different, prescriptions or different patterns that you see. And those are all kind of assumed based on certain heuristics. So like if I get a lifter who comes to me who maybe has like really long legs and a very hingy looking squat, and they tell me, hey, like, I've run 3 days of squatting in the past, or I've done high rep squatting and like my hips just get beat up or my back gets really beat up. That's an example where I'd be able to refer back to my experience with lifters like that and say, you know what, like high rep squatting is probably not going to be the move for that lifter. Like we probably have to work in lower rep ranges on average. We probably have to mitigate the number of times that we push RPE considerably high because those secondary structures like their back or their hips just get too fatigued for them to recover. And then we maybe fill the gap with, some sort of leg accessory or hypertrophy work that doesn't destroy their back or their hips. And then on the flip side of that, you might get a lifter who's the same weight class, but they're built like a corgi and they have little stumpy legs. And the best option for them is to do, sets of 8 on squat, like on their primary day after a top set. Right. So like there's all these little different things that we've learned, but it all falls under the umbrella of like, how do we orient the training week so that we feel ready to go for the primary day, that we have enough workload to progress, but it's kind of just sitting at that sweet spot where predictability of performance is high. So like if you've seen like the upside down U curve of progress and volume, if you were to pinpoint where you would train most of the time, you're probably like oscillating about that peak of the upside down U, depending on where you're at in a training block or where you're at in a training year. So
Yeah, so that's super interesting because like I think one thing with CrossFit that we have a lot of issues with is all the variety of things going on. A typical CrossFit program tends to, from week to week, you see variations in movements and all that. And if someone has a specific focus in like area that they want to work on, whether it's a gymnastics, Olympic lifting, powerlifting movement, that tends to be consistent throughout the week. But then you're still working all these other movements, right? Like let's say you're going through you're looking to build your squat. You're going through a progression with squats and lower body strength, but you're still doing the high intensity gymnastics with paired with like a bike or a rower, metcon and things like that.
yeah.
So that tends to interfere a lot. So I'm curious to see, like, from a pure powerlifting perspective, how long does it take for you to see an athlete actually improve? Like, when do you realize typically? Because I know it varies from person to person, but like, okay, they're not someone who handles high rep work really well. They're closer to the higher intensity work. Like, how long does that usually take for you as a powerlifting coach?
So that's a great question. I think in either scenario, because I could think of like two types of athletes that are going to come to you, right? It's either someone who's very new and has very limited training data in the past, or you have someone who is very established, maybe even an elite level lifter, and they have a ton of information to gather for you that you can go over on like an onboarding call, right? And in that circumstance on an onboarding call, I'm looking to learn as much as I possibly can from that lifter about what they've done in the past, what's worked, what hasn't. And when we go through their old training, I'm going to be able to say, this element of what you've done, I want to keep. And this element of what you've done in the past that didn't work, our conversation kind of illuminated for me why it didn't work. Like I can immediately be able to recall, another training experience or just a certain concept. Like I'll give you an example, right? If someone comes to me and, they show me their squat programming and they say that, every primary day the bar felt kind of heavy on my back and, going into the meet, just everything started to feel heavy as I was ramping up and it just never really felt strong. And then I look at their program and maybe their squat day that preceded their primary was 4 days before and it was super light. Like that's a telltale sign to me that either like your squat day, your secondary squat day was too far away or it was too light. Like you needed something heavy on that day to prime you for that primary, right? So if there's something that stands out very obviously like that, I would say I'm right a lot of the time because there aren't too many ways that a problem like that can be solved. Like there are a lot of situations that you can when you pick up on a negative response, there are only so many ways that that can be remedied, at least within the framework that a lot of us have established, which is part of building this model is it's narrowing down options. But circumstances like that, the improvement will be kind of immediate. Um, but if I'm in a situation where I'm working with, someone who's like very elite, where their rate of progress, even if they are doing everything right, is already very slow, I would say within that first, I guess what I would call like a macro cycle, is when we'll at least have an answer on what we need to do. So if a block length is like 4 blocks long, and or sorry, 4 weeks long. A macro cycle might be three of those 4 week blocks, so 12 weeks, let's say. And unless something is going like really wrong, like we discover within that first block that we're just flat out doing something incorrectly, but if that's the case, then obviously something we need to change right away. But if we find that things are kind of just going well, you feel good, we'll probably see things through the whole 12-week period and then kind of reassess and say, hey, like, what do we need to tweak? What needs to be, modified so that we can, like if we feel like there's more to be desired, then we can make a change. But I would say in the circumstance of a lifter with a lot of training data coming to me, or a lifter who's just maybe new and has not really refined programming that preceded us working together, I would say within the first 1 to 2 blocks, we'll have an answer. And like I said, if I'm not going to claim to have a magic pill where everyone is getting stronger within the first block, but most of the time, if communication is good on the athlete's end, when things aren't going well, we can narrow down pretty quickly what the cause of that problem was.
Yeah. And do you usually just do basically like session feedback forms, or is there other pieces of information you're looking at, like other pieces of data, or is it just
So
like based on their numbers?
no, that's a good question. So the thing that I've learned through coaching powerlifting is that athletes hate filling stuff out. Like I don't think I truly cannot think of a single high level powerlifting coach who has people fill out like formal sort of feedback stuff. Like we all have notes sections in our spreadsheets for the programs so that people can fill in what is pertinent to a session. But formalities, powerlifters don't do it. It's the participation rate is very low. So with that, a lot of us communicate kind of on a per session basis. Now, it doesn't mean that we communicate within the session with the athlete, but I think the rule of thumb a lot of us have is, the number of sessions you train in a week is kind of the number of times I'd expect to have some sort of summary from a lifter. And usually what that summary would consist of is like a pre, a during, and a post, which basically would mean like the pre establishes whatever external variables and circumstances coming into the session there were, be it things that are completely external to you, like had, I didn't sleep very well, or, my dog died, or, broke up with my girlfriend and I didn't sleep, like all those kind of things that set the stage for how poor recovery is. And then along with that, like what you actually felt, right? So like my back was feeling smoked, my legs were really sore, stuff like that, that sets the expectation and already gives us an idea in our heads of like what kind of session we expect to have, or at least because you can have sessions that go great in spite of bad things happening before, but we at least get an idea of what the magnitude of stress was in everything that preceded the session. The during obviously would be the videos, the weight was hit, the RPE, all that sort of stuff. And then the post would be some sort of reflection of like, hey, the bar felt really light on my back. Technique felt really solid. Like I didn't have to think today. Everything's kind of on cruise control. Or I felt like I did not have my legs underneath me at all. The technique felt very foreign. Like all of that kind of organized and summarized in a post session message um, gives us as coaches a lot to work with, because if I'm thinking about, someone coming into the end of a training block where they have, let's say, a heavy squat single and it goes terribly, right? The reason is not always that they're fatigued, right? That's not always the reason that something goes poorly.
Mhm.
It could be the opposite. It could be that you're not doing enough, right? It could be that you're just understimulated. So if I were to receive a message that said, felt great, energy's high, got the bar on my back, it felt like a brick, I'm not going to be inclined to think, oh, this person needs a deload. I'm going to go look at their program and say, well, what are you doing in the session that precedes this? Is it close enough to this primary day? Is it heavy enough? Is it enough volume? Like, are you actually adapting to a stimulus before this session, or are you just getting weaker because you're undertrained? Right. And then the flip side of that is, yeah, I feel smoked and I didn't expect to have a good day and it sucked. Right. Like the outcome is the same in both of those situations, but how we arrive there is different. So what I'm going to do on the coaching side of things is completely different.
Yeah. Oh, that's super interesting. And with that, like, when if someone were to say like, "Hey, I'm trashed," they're actually like really poorly recovered and everything, and that's not why they're hitting the numbers you want them to hit. Um, do you usually do like, "Oh man, I was planning on doing a deload for you like in X amount of weeks. We're gonna just move that up," or do you just, have them maybe bring down intensity for a little bit but still keep volume? How do you usually approach that?
Yeah. So I would say if someone is like chronically beat, like they just have pains that are arising, they are so far from being able to hit, whatever the prescribed load is, or they just miss the mark so terribly. That might be a situation where I would say, you know what, like while we, maybe we feel like the underlying structure for everything is good, but you're just too beat up, like we might subtract 10 or 12% from the working loads for that muscle group or movement for the next couple sessions and move into another block. But I think a lot of us don't necessarily program like full on deloads anymore. I would say a lot of times the transition between blocks kind of serves as a deload. So like that week one of the successive block is usually an opportunity for athletes to decompress. And because we do kind of pace things very carefully, so like, we're not ramping up volume across the training block just for the sake of it. We usually are not spending too many weeks loading something exceedingly heavy. So because of that, the fatigue a lot of times, I mean, hopefully, right? This is the goal, is like the fatigue a lot of times that we develop can be dissipated quickly. So usually when you kind of reset into the next block, let's say you are just rerunning the same structure that you've run on the previous block, but maybe your top sets are going down a rep to give you access to a higher percentage. That week one might serve as a sufficient like deload, quote unquote, um, so that the athlete can then progress through that final block. Um, but if there is a circumstance where someone is just so fatigued, and we go back and look at the program and say like there might just be a total mismatch of training volume or rep ranges, or maybe the time between. So like I'll use an opposite example, like let's say your deadlift days are too close together, or there's too much interference between your squat and deadlift. Like I might not necessarily program like a deload in the sense that it's just a throwaway week, but I'm probably going to sit down and say, you know what, the schedule of these days, like the days on which you squat and deadlift, the days between those movements is probably off. I probably made a mistake. So I need to reorient that. And the exertions, like the prescribed RPEs or percentages, will be reset to like a week one type load. But it would be in a circumstance like that, like a complete reset and transition into a different block structure overall. And when I write that, it's not with the intent of just having a week that looks like that and then going back to the same thing. If I were doing something like that, I would be sitting down writing that with the intent of, no, I think that this is the best structure for us to run going forward in general.
Okay. Yeah, so it's interesting because I also work as a strength and conditioning coach at the college level, right?
Was it?
Where there's a lot of archaic thoughts of programming for the strength side of it.
Yep.
Um, there's I'm a big believer that when you're working with like athletes who have so many things going on, their main sport, right? The practices of their main sport and all the variables associated with that, the life stressors of a student. And then they're coming in for strength and conditioning work to, basically piece the puzzles together to become a better athlete at their sport. It's definitely a different approach than powerlifting, where powerlifting, that is the sport. That's what you need to optimize. But that being said, I feel like there's a lot of things that you're mentioning as a powerlifting coach that would be extremely beneficial for strength and conditioning. Because there is a lot of things like that, not looking at I think there's always a program deload, typically, not always. Typically there's like a program deload. Looking at the variables, a lot of times it's being pushed a lot. You mentioned like that you take like a careful approach in progressing someone, right? You're not just like hitting them with all this volume and all those things. And I think that's extremely important. And sometimes you're trying to get the most out of these athletes. And what I notice, and I'm not going to say I'm innocent to this too, sometimes like you push it a little bit too fast, too soon
Yeah.
type thing. And so it's interesting that, even someone whose main sport is powerlifting, you're taking a careful approach. So I feel like that should be something that should be translated on that side too, with working with athletes of other sports. Like, they like taking that careful approach. And that's something I've tried to be a little bit better about as well. Just like not rushing it too much too soon. Because like you say, all these things arise when that happens. The pains and the aches and all that.
Yeah.
So I know you work with powerlifters and a lot of elite level powerlifters as well, as you are one. Is there something in particular, like actually, let me backtrack. Let's say someone who does CrossFit comes to you and they're just like, "Hey, Sean, I really want to improve my squat. I've had a hard time with that. That's always been a weakness of mine, and I really want to take the dedicated time to do this, but I also want to still." Do CrossFit things on the side. If I have to give up some of the CrossFit stuff, I will, but I'm not going to give up entirely because there are skills and things I still need to practice for my sport. How would you approach that?
So if I'm being totally honest with you, I think that it would be very easy. I frankly think that on the on the CrossFit side, general strength and conditioning side, even weightlifting side, there just hasn't been a progression in like understanding how to get people stronger.
Mhm.
Um, I think like I was talking to, so I helped one of my buddies who's on the world team for the U.S. in Olympic weightlifting. He's a 109 kilo guy. I helped him cut for his last competition. And when we were on the call, we were just talking about how we would approach this. And he had mentioned to me how, you know, basically on the weightlifting side, like this method of cutting is kind of unknown um, in terms of just like how to execute it well and not just, do like an old fashioned, not just, I'm not saying that water cuts are bad, water cuts are perfectly fine, but like the way of executing it is very antiquated in that space. And then the way that he described programming to me being done in the Olympic weightlifting setting, specifically for something like a squat, is just very antiquated. Like if you train at a gym, you guys all run the same program and it's like, hey, we're doing tens or we're doing eights and then we're going to do 5x5s. And it's just, it's not, it's not the best way to do it. And I think that the entire strength and conditioning world, I'm sure CrossFit is still in that frame of mind. So what we do in powerlifting, right, is we try to find the like overall dosage or volume for a given lift, what rep range sensitivities someone may have in order to progress, meaning that, like, sure, the average person may respond well to eights during a certain period of time, fives during a certain period of time, threes for a certain period of time. But you train long enough or you progress to a certain level and the window or the set of things that you can do to progress becomes smaller and smaller, right? And that's what we've kind of learned in our position as high level powerlifting coaches, which is that you know we don't change things often. We change things if they stop working, but we don't change the underlying structure of a like a squat protocol often. We don't really change volume within a training block. We just progress the load on the bar on those top sets and obviously those back downs to a degree. Um, but there's a, what am I trying to say here? There's a dosage in every set, I guess, that is ideal for certain lifters. Like if someone came to me on the CrossFit side and needed to progress their squat, one of my first questions would be like, okay, how many days a week do you squat? And if they say one, well, it's a no-brainer that we probably have to squat twice a week. And if within that one day they're just doing like a 5x5 or 4 sets of 8, I'm like, well, this is kind of junk because either you're not touching a weight that you like adequately can push towards some high exertion on if you're doing a set prescribed weight, right? Because to be able to repeat, a considerably high percentage for every set is going to be pretty impossible for most people. Or you're just doing, fairly submaximal work for all of your sets, and that's the only exposure you get to squatting in a week. So, my default would probably be to increase the frequency, take a look at how they move. Like, are they someone who I think they can get a lot out of competition squatting for their hypertrophy work for their legs, or do they need something else? Um, kind of like I said, they're within every frequency of doing a lift, there's like a spectrum of how maxed out or like bare minimum you are on that. So like you could have two people who squat twice a week. One has, a top set on their primary day and like very light back downs. And then their secondary day might just be like very light uh high bar, let's say, where like the average intensity of that session is super low. And then you might have another person who squats twice a week and they have like a heavy top set on both days. And maybe the average intensity of their back downs on both days is higher than that other guy that I just mentioned. Right. So it's like you have a scale of like how much you can really push a given frequency. And once you figure out what frequency a lifter responds well to, you're trying to figure out where you are on that spectrum. So in all honesty, I think that it would be very easy to progress a singular lift because, you know, if that's the singular area of focus where they have to be very numbers driven, I think it's almost easier on my end to progress something like that, not having to worry about the two other lifts being their absolute best as well. They're doing their CrossFit stuff in different energy systems entirely. Like, sure, general fatigue is probably going to play a role, and maybe we can't ramp up squat on the same timeline that we're ramping up our running, but that doesn't mean that that can't be offset, and we can still run the block towards some sort of considerable progression, but just staggered from when we have to ramp up on another skill.
So you mentioned with your athletes, you add hypertrophy in their work. So kind of want you to go into a little bit about that. And also, do you add anything else? Like, is there conditioning work that you do? Anything else on top of that?
Yeah, so that's an awesome question as well. The way that I would say a lot of us view accessory work is, let me think how to, I'll give you a good analogy here. So if you've ever played any video games where like a character has certain stats, right? Like my example, because I played baseball, I played like a lot of baseball games growing up. And in those games, you can create a player, right? You create your own custom player. And at the beginning of the season, he sucks, right? Like you have to play games and get better in order for that player to get better. But every player has a set of stats, right? And it could be their speed, power, contact, fielding ability, whatever it is, right? With strength, there are multiple different things that contribute to that, right? You have, whether or not your technique is optimized for that lift, whether or not you have like the neural efficiency yet, whether or not you have enough muscle, right? There's all these different factors that play a role. And obviously, from the programming side of things, it's our belief that for most of the way, because of what we've learned, we can get you there through doing the main movements, right? But for one reason or another, there are going to be different stats of yours that are now limiting factors, right? Like if you think of chemistry, right? Like a reaction has a limiting reactant where like no matter how much you add of the other thing, if you don't have enough of the thing that you're missing, you can't have the reaction go, right? So like if I, do all the comp squatting in the world, but I am just like very hingy and have smaller legs, and like that's my limiting factor, hypertrophy, then I need to be doing something to drive that up. So every lifter that we coach is going to have accessory work. Every lifter that we have is going to have hypertrophy work. Now, if we are in a circumstance where we know that what we're doing on the competition lifts is sufficient to drive up the competition lifts, then we would be wary to add any sort of hypertrophy work that would interfere with performance on that. And I'll give you a good example. So let's say you are a 700-pound squatter and the layout that we have for your squat is like really solid, right? Like it's very predictable performance wise. You recover well, you're progressing well. I'm not going to be inclined to add a hack squat to that lifter's program, right? Because he clearly doesn't need more leg mass to improve his squat. And he certainly doesn't need this lengthened, focused, very fatiguing leg movement in his program that can now stifle the progression that we had on squat and add unnecessary fatigue to the program, right? So that would be like just a total mismatch of a prescription for a lifter like that. But on the flip side, I might, like I said, I might have a lifter who just generally is newer to lifting, or maybe just has gotten away with kind of squatting. They've gotten to their point of competency on squat without really building up strong legs, but now they're stuck at like a 500-pound squat. And if you're like a 181 or, an 83 kilo lifter with a 500-pound squat, like it's impressive for Gen Pop, but like you're not going to be competitive with a 500-pound squat. Where is your limiting reactant right now? For you, the hack squat might be an option, or a leg press, or a belt squat. And the interesting thing that I've seen, I've seen it way more on the upper body side of things, which, funny enough, I mean, it works in both circumstances if applied well. But the thing that's interesting is like we think of a lot of the bodybuilding stuff as kind of this like long-term development, right? Like you put in the work now and you get this like future dividend, right? Like it really pays well in the future. But I don't think that we understand strength in like a clinical setting very well. I think in the powerlifting world we get it very well, but none of this has been applied in actual science, which is fine. I don't really care for too much exercise science stuff. A lot of it either reasserts the obvious or just affirms something that is not true. But at any rate, the thing that we've noticed that's very interesting is like strength can be uncovered or facilitated very quickly. Like you can see a turnaround in performance where someone's deadlifts like estimated 1 RM. Like let's say we are in a block of, you know, doing single, I mean, whatever rep rate, it doesn't matter. We can see someone see a spike in their E1RM of like 50 pounds in like 2 weeks. And it's not that they built more muscle in that time, and it's not that they dissipated fatigue, but something that they're doing brought that adaptation out of them very quickly. And it's pretty remarkable how quickly that happens. And there are circumstances where, like on paper, like let's say you're a a strength and conditioning coach, or you've taken your CSCS and you have all these certs, whatever, you'd be like, okay, I added, this chest press and this weighted dip to someone's program. Like, yeah, it's going to build more muscle for them in 4 weeks time or 8 weeks time, or maybe it's going to create some fatigue. So maybe just be mindful of that because your bench might feel worse. Like, if applied correctly, that person PRs their bench in like a week, 2 weeks. Like, it's amazing how when something is the limiting factor, an accessory movement in real time can drive up the competition lift. So those are like the two camps that we end up in, is like there are a lot of accessories that you can just apply generally that don't really have a cost to the main lifts. Like if I give you bicep curls, like none of your lifts are going to suffer. If I give you lateral raises, none of your lifts are going to suffer. If I give you rows or pull downs, like, okay, maybe I want to be mindful to maybe not put them on the day before you do your primary deadlift day, but like that's general strength that's going to be built up through a range of motion to target tissue that is not really going to beat up the main lift. But like if you're jacked and I give you heavy weighted dips 2 days before your primary bench, like that might be stupid. If you have massive legs and you've never done a hack squat with me and I give you a hack squat, your squat might tank. Like there's a set of accessories that we can kind of just apply generally. And then there are others where we're like, okay, is this filling a gap that we're not getting on the main lift?
Yeah. I think that's a good like representation of like the art of coaching and good programming. Like thinking about those things. And I don't know about you what you think of it, but I think like that comes with studying the sport and being like, have that term that they use. It's like having a PhD in your sport. I think that's one of those things that makes a good coach, and also doing it yourself too. So you being a power lifter and being a really good one too, understanding how that feels and actually knowing. And that I think that's one of my big things is like a coach should know how it feels. I
Mhm.
think a lot of good coaches have good knowledge, but I think the best coaches tend to have good knowledge, do a lot of studying, and also know how it feels themselves. And I think you have a really good background on that. And
I
then
appreciate.
another thing too, I think it's funny, like the way you speak, I understand, like the chemistry analogy, like that right there is like, yeah, I get what you're talking about. So I appreciate that.
You know how frustrating it's. So this is one of my weaknesses as a coach is like I do very well at visualizing a lot of verbal stuff. So when I explain something like that, chemistry wise, or like I can give someone the example of, so like I have a kid that I coach who has a PhD in quantum physics, so very smart guy. So like if I'm explaining to him like wedging on a sumo deadlift, I was like, okay, your entire torso down to your hips, like they need to move like a rigid body, right? Like the equation of motion on one side is the same as the other. Like that's elementary to him, right? But like if I have to explain that concept to someone who's never taken a physics class, it's like, okay, like how do I dumb this down in a way that maybe features more like tactile cueing or sensational cueing? Like I do
Yeah.
very well with the more verbal and visualization stuff, but in terms of like I have a friend of mine, one of my business partners at powerlifting now, and one of my best friends. He was one of my first athletes, Matt Cronin. Like he's really good at that stuff. So like there was one of his lifters years ago. He was programming like a pin press, which if anyone's unfamiliar listening, it's you just bench down to like the safety pins being set up on the rack. So instead of hitting your chest, you're hitting the pin. And the way that he cued for somebody being able to, maintain tension and not hit the pins too hard was like, pretend your newborn's in the other room, like don't wake the baby. And like that's something that I would not think of,
That's a good one.
but
Yeah.
like something like that is now very, very very real world, very like sensation driven, where someone can hear that and go, okay, I'm going to internalize that, imagine the outcome, and then tailor my action to it. Whereas for me, I do much better and explain much better giving the inputs rather than what it should result in, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too, which I know when I'm coaching like teams and all that, I think sometimes the way I cue isn't the way they reciprocate, like they understand information, which is their. So I get a lot of questions as they're doing the movement because they're like, you mentioned this, but I have no idea what you were talking about. So yeah. Um, Yeah, that's a good one. Pretend the baby's in the other room. Um, so this is I've been super curious from there's all these like different let's say powerlifting programs out there, right? There's like the 5x5, there's German training volume, there's 531, West Side, all these different styles of training. Is there one that you're like, yeah, this is a pretty solid program for like general pop or someone who's strong but not like elite level powerlifter? Or do you caution most people to go away from that and take a different approach? And if so, what's the approach you like to take? Is it percentage, RPE?
So I would say this. I would never refer anyone who doesn't want to pay for a coach to 531 or Westside or any of those programs that you mentioned. Um, just because I don't think that they would be the best option of what's available for free. Like I think there's such an abundance of good free information nowadays that there would just simply be better choices. Like my old coach Steve Denovi has a free 15-week program and different iterations of it that I think would work really well for people who are looking to maybe train like a power lifter but not necessarily hire a coach. I mean, if you just wanted to get generally strong, like you'll get stronger running a 531 or a conjugate or whatever. Um, but I don't think that would be the best option. What I would say is there's certainly elements of like West Side and Conjugate that Louis got really right. Like I think macro scope West Side is really good in the sense that he knew on some level that in order to drive up your numbers and top end strength, that you had to train different qualities for each of the lifts. Um, and how that got applied within West Side was like you'd have a max effort day, you would have like a dynamic effort day, and then you would have like a hypertrophy day, or even um, yeah, that you'd have like a hypertrophy day, a dynamic effort, or a max effort. How that got applied, I think, was by today's standards, um, kind of crude or simply not enough. Like I know that in that context, because Louis was training guys on steroids, usually very heavy, right? So like your ability to handle more work kind of goes down the heavier you get, especially at a time where they were just eating to eat. So they were in very poor shape as well. And then frankly, there's nobody to push against their level of strength. Like back then they were the standard. So it's hard to assess what you're doing wrong when there's nobody to compare yourself to that's better. Um, so for example, like they all did each lift once a week, which like nowadays maybe, and again, kind of fitting the archetype, like if you're Jesus Olivares, who's the strongest lifter in the world, like, yeah, he squats once a week, but he's 400 pounds and he's squatting 1,000 pounds. Like, yeah, maybe one day a week is sufficient for him, but that's not the average person that's running a program. Maybe I would say on my entire roster, the only time someone's doing a lift only once a week is deadlift. Usually, if that's the case, it's someone who pulls conventional, unless there's some sort of like weird extenuating circumstance with durability or pains that arise from doing it more often. Um, so like the frequency side of thing was not applied correctly within that model. The specificity side of things was not well applied on a larger sense because like you might not be doing the competition lift every time that you do your squat day or your bench day or your deadlift day. Like further than frequency, your exposure to the main lifts was not frequent enough. But like that skeleton kind of underlies a lot of what we do. Like we know that we can't just be, you know, stacking our chips in the max effort bucket. Like it's very costly to push max effort, especially the stronger you get, right? So like it gives you the exposure to that intensity, but the stronger you get, the more fatiguing that becomes. And because that's a skill you've developed so well, the less often you really need to be exposed to it, right? It's not to say that we don't expose people to it, but if you're a 900-pound squatter, like if you're put under a 1 RM, your body's going to know how to grind. Like that's not a skill that you're going to lose to a great degree. Whereas if you're 2 years into the sport, like, yeah, that's a quality that probably needs to and can be trained more often. So, in essence, that conjugate principle is applied within our training. Like we have days that are intentionally submaximal and intended for recovery. Could you call that dynamic effort by Louis standards? Like, yeah, probably. We're not doing like 10 sets of two every minute on the minute, but like we might be doing, 4 sets of three with 62%, where it's like very light. We could probably do a set of 10 with it. In its essence, it is like
Yeah.
dynamic effort. And then we do have our, variation days. Do we just have variation days just because we have variation days? No, right? Some lifters don't need variations, but for the ones that do, it's applied for the same reason Louis applied it, right? If you have, your ability to hinge is poor, like maybe I have you doing an RDL or a conventional deadlift because, yeah, you pull sumo, but if you don't know how to hinge, your sumo is going to suffer. Or, you're 16 years old when you got into powerlifting. You immediately bought the SBD belt. You started arching as hard as you could. You went max grip. You never trained flat back close grip like a bro. Like maybe you need to do that, right? So, at its core, it is a long standing. It's a method that's endured across the decades. So it was correct in many ways, but obviously is applied very differently now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. That is one thing I really liked that he did was the structure of the week. Like usually it was what max at like you were saying, max effort, dynamic rest, dynamic max. Yeah, I agree. And yes, I actually, as you were mentioning it, what's his name? Steve, the guy you worked with, powerlift.
Novi. Yep.
Yeah, I did run that 15-week program for a bit just to test it out, and I really liked it. So highly recommend for anyone listening.
Yeah.
You can find that. Is it on powerlifting now,
So
or
powerlifting
is it
now,
PRS?
yeah. So his Instagram is PR's Performance. If you were to Google that, or you Google Steve DeNovi free program, you'll probably find it. Um, yeah, because powerlifting now we put out informative content, but that's a subscription based service. So if you were just looking for a free program, there's that. Johnny Candido has some good free programs. Calgary Barbell has some good free programs. That's what I'm saying. If you're looking to get your feet wet in like quality powerlifting and get competent at the movements, I think there are just better options than a 531 or a West Side. So
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Um, One thing I'm curious about is you mentioned exercise science and how a lot of times they kind of prove the obvious, which
yeah.
I feel 100% about that. Sometimes they'll be like new study shows like carbs increases perform like helps with performance. It's like I thought we already knew this like 20 years ago, but okay.
Yep.
I've noticed a lot of the stuff is a bit obvious. But that being said, there's a side of exercise science that I find interesting. And it's just like new training, I implementations and all that. And one of them being like velocity based training stuff. So do you think that's something that can be applied to powerlifting? Do you ever look at bar speed at all?
So I mean it does get applied in the powerlifting space. Like I think the concept of like using um the bar velocity trackers originated in powerlifting. And I think that if you're someone who is very objective and can accumulate a lot of data with a tracker, it certainly can help. Like you would definitely be able to tell on some days, like, oh, this last warm up moved, 0.05 faster or 0.08 faster than last week. Like I'm in a better spot. But I just don't see it as necessary. Like to put it bluntly, none of us on the elite coaching side of things tell our lifters to buy velocity trackers. I don't think it's particularly useful, um, in the sense that you can't tell from your eye, right? Like you can very easily tell whether or not somebody is on. A newer lifter maybe can't, but that's like the exact person that it might be like marginally more helpful for is the person that it would be information overload for. For a higher level lifter, you have a very good grasp of how you're going to feel on the day. You have a very good grasp of like, and that's why power lifters are like so like particular about how they warm up a lot of times because it's like if I've taken 220 kilos on squat 1,000 times, I know how 220 feels. So any given day where it feels better than usual, I can tell very quickly. Or any given day that it feels worse than usual, I can tell very quickly. So I don't find it to be particularly useful. I would certainly not advise lifters to get one. I have one lifter currently who uses it, but I he tracks the data in his spreadsheet. I have never once referred to it for making programming decisions.
Right.
It's just I don't think that it really informs much. If it gives a lifter peace of mind to be able to say, I definitely feel better today, and it gives them that boost of confidence of, wow, I felt better today, and my bar velo is up, and it's the end of block, and I want to go for a PR. I can feel confident that I can hit it. Sure, go ahead. Um, but I think it would make a lifter too cerebral on average. And then worst case scenario, maybe you have a day where, the reading on the machines, the reading on the tracker is maybe worse than what you anticipated. And now it's kind of killed your confidence for the next top set when maybe that day you actually were stronger, but the way that you were moving just didn't trigger as much of like a peak velocity on the tracker as it did on another day. Like you could have a lift on one day that has like a higher peak velo, but the sticking point was more pronounced. And then you have another day where like the average velo is higher, but the peak velo is lower. And who knows, like maybe that average velo day was the day you could have PR'd and the other one was where you would have gotten stapled. So it's just long story short, I don't find it particularly helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if you noticed, like, I don't know what your Instagram feed usually consists of. Mine's like a lot of, it ranges from like French bulldogs to strength and conditioning stuff, and a lot of times like college strength and conditioning. And there's all this technology now, like velocity-based trainer, trackers, there's force plates, there's, GPS data, and it's cool. It's interesting. I like it. I mean, I'm going down more the sports science route at work anyways, so like that falls into my world of things, but like I'm also think like I'm someone where it's like it's a lot of objective data. It could definitely get into the someone's head a lot, like you were saying, like especially people who are most of the time like high level power lifters where they're very particular about their things, like you were saying, that could easily get into someone's head,
Yep.
like and mess with them. So I agree with you on that. Like I love that stuff. I nerd out about it, but it's one of the most like unnecessary things, I think,
Yeah.
for a lot of there's some applications, but very rarely am I like, yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah. No, I had a couple fraternity brothers when I was in college. One of the startups they were working on was like a 3D camera for like college weight rooms. And the concept was cool, but I don't know where they're at right now. I don't want to speak incorrectly or speak poorly, but certainly at the time it wasn't really taking off. And I think it's just because kind of like what I had alluded to with the bar velo trackers, it's just not necessary. You have a good coaching eye, you're going to build enough competency technique wise, and especially in a weight room where the lifting is just a means to an end and it's not the end itself. It just I don't know that it matters really all too
Yeah.
much. It's cool stuff, but I just don't think that it's very practical. I don't think it's incentivizing to use.
Yeah, I agree. I think people try to chase the new big thing out there and all that. I think
Yeah.
good training is good training. Um, Curious, you use usually RPE versus percentage based work, correct? Or do you do a
No, we
mixture of
use
both?
we definitely use both.
Okay.
Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's definitely a mixture of both. Uh,
Okay.
it really depends on the lift. It depends on the lifter. So, yeah, I mean, this is a rabbit hole we could definitely go down. For top sets, it's usually going to be RPE based, but at the same time, when you've worked with a lifter long enough, like especially when you get to um, you know, enough time under your belt with like a high level lifter, you're going to program RPEs, but chances are what you're doing is you're working backwards from a target weight that you want to end the block at, and you're just working backward in the jumps that are required to get there. So, kind of like I was saying at the beginning of this podcast, how we pace things appropriately. There are often times where certain lifters, I mean, you could fall in one of two camps, really. You might have certain lifters who need to train above a certain intensity threshold to quote unquote feel trained enough to perform well. And then there are others where if I were to take a weight that was too heavy on week 3, I'm going to be too fried for week 4. So we need to be very delicate about how we create that progression. So, like, I might have a lifter where, let's say, we're trying to get up to a 750 triple on deadlift, let's say, and that's week 4 at the end of a big macro cycle. Their week 3, we might only touch 683. Like the progression might be like 600, 633, 683, and then 750 on that week 4, right? So it's like a very linear increase and then a big jump to that week 4, because we know, like, from a training standpoint, those are like kind of the minimums or the maximums really we need to touch to have ourselves ready for that week 4. So while RPE will be written in the program, chances are in a circumstance like that, we're kind of just planning backwards. Like, okay, we need to just be in this range to set ourselves up for that final week. Um, if we have back down work that really needs to be monitored, in the sense that if it got pushed too hard, it would be too fatiguing, you're probably going to be using percentages in those circumstances, because those percentages that they need to hit probably going to be difficult to rate on an RPE scale. Like I said earlier, if I were doing, and this is something in my program, like this past week, I did 4 sets of 5 on squat after my top set with 413 pounds. I could probably do all of those sets for like a set of 15. But what am I going to write on the program? RP 0? Like that's silly. And then if I wrote RP 5 and I took the same weight, if I took 413, it wasn't an RP 5, right? So, like, there are circumstances where moderating the rate of progress necessitates percentage based work. Um, for bench press, I'm going to be less inclined to use RPE, or sorry, I'm going to be less inclined to use percentages, because people can have very weird sort of like percentage to RPE relationships, where make like a standard chart that you look at for RP and percentage, right? It might say, okay, you can do a triple with 90%, or you could do a set of 8 with 70%. With something like bench press, especially depending on how you do, how you perform the lift technique wise, you might be able to do a triple with 96%. You might be able to do a set of 8 with 80%, right? And with a lift like bench, where within reason, obviously, there are certainly circumstances that merit it, but most of the time, like, bench is not as fatiguing. That's why people on average perform bench more frequently than the other two lifts. Like, leaving it more RPE based, I think is more acceptable. So we definitely use a mixture of both. I think what gets applied really depends on like what the purpose of that set of reps actually is.
Yeah. No, that's definitely a good point. The RP 0, right? This is off topic, but I was listening to a podcast this weekend, and the guy was like, yeah, I do podcasts because I can't afford having consultations with really good coaches, or I can't afford therapy. And so podcasts allow me to do that with all these people. So, like, I feel like that's what I'm doing right now. All right, cool. So, oh, I just saw an email. Sorry. For some reason it said you messaged me.
No, you're good.
Okay, cool. So last question I want to ask you is this is more of a personal thing, because I know you were a mechanical engineer,
Yep.
graduated from MIT as a mechanical engineer. I don't remember what career you took right after you graduated. Was it with the NIH?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So go ahead. Sorry.
oh yeah, no. So like with that, like what caused you to transition full-time coaching, and how difficult was that?
Yeah.
'Cause-
So Honestly, I think like a lot of people. So I've had this conversation with a lot of the guys that I went to MIT with. Like I remember being in college and kind of saying like, if you know what you want to do, like MIT is amazing because you have resources at your disposal that you will never have again in your life unless you stay in the academic realm or you move on to whatever corresponding professional realm that is. But in terms of what's available to you, it's truly special. But if you don't know what you want to do, I think that it can be a very not negative place, but certainly challenging place to navigate because there's so much you have to do, and that limits pretty drastically the amount of time you have to figure out what you want to do. And I definitely fell into that camp where like I did very well coming into college. Like, math and science was obviously I wouldn't even say it was necessarily the passion, but I think that in terms of what's available to you as a high school kid, like the most intellectually stimulating stuff usually is in the STEM area. So that's just if you're smart, if you're above a threshold of intelligence, that's just like what you do because that's what's available to you. That's what's uh, I guess praised in society. Like there's no push toward the arts or writing or anything anymore because we live in a very technology driven world. So getting to MIT after the first year, I had declared mechanical engineering because I knew I didn't want to do any coding. And it seemed like just like general enough. Like, okay, what's the second most popular major? What could be applicable to whatever I decide to do after I graduate? Fine. I do the first 2 years of mechie or a year and a half, and I realized I don't want to do this as a career. So I decided to pick up pre med. So, I finished out mechanical engineering because I was in too deep and it was very manageable to do both pre-med and mechie stuff. So, finished the mechie degree along with whatever miscellaneous bio and chemistry stuff I needed to do for pre-med. And all the while I was coaching lifters, just as like my thing that I did while I was in college. And then once I got to the NIH and no longer had a course load, obviously I was working at the NIH, but I also now had what I would call more of like a part-time job as a coach because I went from coaching maybe 15 to 20 people in college, most of whom were people that I trained with in the area, to now coaching, 30, 35 people, where now it was more scattered across the country and across the world. So while working at the NIH, I think I realized very quickly that the medicine route only really appealed to me because it had a stability to it, right? Like the path is very well defined. And I think I was just grasping for control of my future. And once I realized, having been out of college, like, okay, I don't really want to do this. I think I just needed something to make me feel like I was on a defined path. Um, I definitely like started to feel a lot of stress and anxiety related to that. And because when you work any real job, you're not allowed to just disappear whenever you want. You have a certain number of vacation days. And, you know, the amount of traveling that I did, luckily I had a good relationship with my PI, but the amount of traveling I did, I certainly went over that because I was just going to competitions all the time. And I realized I was like, I don't want to, at the very best case, be net zero, net neutral on income because I get a scholarship, but at the worst, be in debt to go to medical school, to have to drop most of my roster, if not all of them. I don't think I would have had to drop all of them, but certainly would not have been able to do coaching to the degree that I was, all to be, 10, 12 years down the road, finally making, maybe maybe a considerable amount more money. I don't know where I would have ended up, but 30 to 50% more money to have missed out on like so many valuable years of my life doing what I wanted to do. Um, it just wasn't worth it to me. So I having been, a good student all my life, I still never, it never sat right with me to like sacrifice like my health and well-being in the way that so many of our peers probably did. Um, and honestly, like COVID was the biggest blessing for me because when everything went on lockdown, like all the serious powerlifters were like, well, a group of us are gonna, train in the gym that we train at while it's quote unquote closed, or I'm just gonna build a home gym. And like during the first month of COVID, like I probably got like 100 inquiries for coaching. And obviously I didn't take all of those on, but it was during that time where I was like, this is something I love to do. This is all I can do right now because nothing's going on in the world. And now I can actually like make a decision going forward of what I want to do with Nori powerlifting, which it was during COVID that I had decided to actually build a team of coaches. So it was during that year that I was like, I'm going to put out an application for interns. I'm going to do an interview process with all these guys. And then by the end of, the interview process, I'll select however many coaches. And then by the end of the internship, I'll have them be full-time coaches. So during 2020 was the year where I was like, there's no turning back from this. Like, this is what I want to do. I'm going to, have a team of coaches. And then now, 4 years down the road, there's, four coaches who work for me. Unfortunately, three along the way prior, had left for certain reasons. One, she was, she's a PhD candidate now. And like, that was the route that she had wanted to go then. So she gave up coaching for that. Another one, we had more personal problems that we had to let go of him. And then the other was just a more career driven focus where he, was really into computer science. And because of his own negative experience as an athlete in powerlifting, he kind of just got sick of the sport and then moved on. But I mean, now it's, four guys who work for me who are just, like ride or die, phenomenal coaches, phenomenal people. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's the whole story of how I got to this place from being a nerd growing up.
Yeah. Yeah. That last question I think was more of a curious question from my end for like, because I feel like we kind of have a similar in terms of that, like going to school, when you're going to school for engineering at in the school like MIT, there's just a lot of pressure. I don't know, like I felt that pressure, like what is, because I wanted to go into strength and conditioning and
Yeah,
coaching, which, is very different from what I studied. And I think sometimes to my own fault, I think too much of what other people think of me and all that. So it was a difficult decision, but it happened during the same time as you during that COVID period. I think it was a good time for me to like sit down and think about what I actually wanted and stuff. And
yeah,
I made a transition out, but I was very lucky I did. Um, yeah, so that's awesome. And like you were saying, the coaches you have all seem like really solid dudes. Like I see you guys talking on the Powerlifting Now podcast and information that you guys set out. So if people wanted to reach out about powerlifting coaching, consultations or follow you on Instagram, where could they get all that information?
yeah. No, of course. So my Instagram is hamstring poppy, poppy spelled PAPI. Um, so that's my Instagram. I have a YouTube channel. I don't really post much. I probably should get back onto it. Just the vlog type stuff is not really my favorite thing to do anymore. In terms of reaching out for coaching, if you are a serious power lifter, teamnori.com. It's team Nori.com. If I had to give you guys a breakdown of like what demographic each coach works with, I'm in a situation where I don't necessarily have open spots. I kind of just take people on as I desire at this point. So I'm very lucky to be in that situation. Um, One of our coaches, Michael Jin, is definitely more tailored toward working with people who want to powerlift amidst sort of like a busier lifestyle. He works with like a lot of older individuals who maybe, have like a, finance job, but they enjoy powerlifting as their way of decompressing. Um, Nathan Tepis is another one of our coaches who definitely would do great with newer or intermediate level lifters. And then Jaron Yamane and Aiden Raider. Um, are definitely kind of in a similar camp to me right now, where their rosters kind of are at capacity. They are looking to work with some more high level lifters if that's who they were going to take on. But I think that if you are listening and you are serious about being the strongest you can, um, throw your hat in the ring, send a very well thought out inquiry, and we'll get back to it. Um, if you want to learn more about powerlifting methodology in general, um, there's a platform I started with a couple other coaches who are not on my team called Powerlifting Now. It is a subscription based service where it's basically what we call the Powerlifters Library. We had decided about 2 years ago that there was no centralized website, centralized playlist for informative long form powerlifting content. A lot of the stuff is either just if any of us ever felt like making a video for YouTube, which is not really incentivized because YouTube doesn't pay well for anybody, or just a lot of gimmicky short form stuff is kind of what you see on Instagram. So we all put out anywhere from like 45-minute to hour-long videos about programming, technique, meet day stuff, nutrition, just coaching in general. It's geared toward athletes and coaches. So if that's something that's interesting to you, the platform's called Powerlifting Now.
Awesome. And then also apparel line. So this t-shirt here that I'm wearing is from Nori Apparel. I also have, I think, two other t-shirts and a pair of shorts. They're all really solid, like really good material stuff. So it's probably one of my favorite. This one's definitely one of my favorite shirts, and the other ones are amazing for lifting.
I appreciate
So,
that. Thank you.
yeah, of course. So Sean, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
I
Like I was
appreciate
telling
you
you,
having me.
I could keep picking your brain for hours. Really interesting stuff. So thank you for spending some time with me, chatting it up, all things
Absolutely.
powerlifting.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And if you ever want me back on for any sort of specific conversation, I'm happy to make some time for
Oh, for sure. I'm going to take you up on
it.
that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.